Hello, welcome back to our channel. Today, we're going to follow a romantic story that quickly turns into a storm full of surprises. Ted and Shanice have been growing closer with each episode. And this is just for reference and discussion. Everyone, it all began on what seemed like a peaceful afternoon when Shanice brought Ted home to meet her mother for the first time. As if to confirm that this relationship was no longer made up of secret dates between work shifts, but had become something more serious. In her mind, Ted was the clearest proof that sometimes fate does not arrive like a lightning strike, but through small conversations between two exhausted people in a city that never sleeps. Their relationship did not begin with blind passion, but with late evenings, when Shanice left the hospital with aching legs and Ted had just escaped a tense council meeting. And the two of them happened to run into each other at the cafe across the street. At first, it was only polite small talk. Then came the times Ted listened to her talk about patience, about the fear of making mistakes, about the loneliness of living in a world always full of expectations. Ted also opened up, sharing the pressure of always having to be the man with the answers, of how every vote he cast felt like another moment of selling off a piece of his conscience. Little by little, the silences between them became fewer, replaced by a sense of peace both of them believed they had missed for far too long. That was why, when they decided to call themselves a couple, the people around them did not see it as a passing infatuation, but as a well-earned reward after years of facing life alone. And they were quickly seen as one of the most stable, promising couples in Fairmont Crest, as if two long straight lines had finally found the one point where they were meant to meet. That was exactly why Shanice was completely unprepared for the moment her mother saw Ted, her eyes freezing for a few seconds before flaring with an emotion both violent and familiar. A kind of anger Shanice had not seen since after her father's funeral. No words were needed, no shouting, but the entire atmosphere in the kitchen, where her mother had been preparing dinner for her daughter, suddenly changed, growing heavy as if the oxygen in the room had been pulled away. Shanice felt that tension seep into her skin like a cold draft, while Ted tried to maintain a calm, polite composure, even though he could sense that something was wrong from the moment her mother let go of his hand more quickly than necessary. In his mind, it might have been the ordinary caution of a mother meeting her daughter's boyfriend for the first time. But that distance did not resemble anything he had experienced when facing the families of former partners. With Nicole, family opposition had always come with clear warnings, sharp questions about loyalty, stability, money, reputation. Here, silence itself was the most frightening accusation. She did not ask much, did not seem interested in getting to know him, only quietly observed him as if trying to fit Ted's face into a memory that had once kept her awake for months. And when that memory came back clearly enough, all that silence shattered, making way for a storm Shanice did not understand at all. A few days later, the secret was exposed, not in a chaotic argument, but in a moment when Shanice's mother could no longer bear hearing her daughter speak of Ted with that glowing happiness, as if he were map leading her out of every mistake in life. She told Shanice about a day many years earlier, when the name Ted Richardson first entered their lives not as the man taking her daughter to dinner, but as a young ambitious lawyer in a courtroom, representing the city in a compensation lawsuit after Shanice's father died. Back then, her father had died in an accident so senseless that no one could truly accept it. A metal staircase in their old building had collapsed while he was rushing downstairs to help an elderly woman into an ambulance. His death was filed under unavoidable accident, but Shanice's mother had been determined not to let it pass like that. She had hoped the law would bring justice, hoped the system would hear the voice of a black widow who had lost her husband to carelessness everyone could see. But on the other side, representing the city, was a young Ted Richardson, sharp, polished, his eyes lighting up each time he found a contradiction in her testimony. Each time he guided a question in a way that turned her grief into personal negligence on paper. He did not lie, but he chose to interpret every detail in the way most favorable to his client and most cruel to the widow trembling at the witness stand. That was the moment Shanice's mother first felt she had not only lost her husband, but had also been robbed of her right to believe his death deserved respect. The trial ended, the city claimed victory, and she left feeling as though she had been crushed all over again beneath the wheels of a machine, with Ted as one of its most effective parts. Years passed, and she tried to bury that memory to focus on raising her daughter, but the face of that young lawyer still haunted her, appearing sometimes in dreams. Sometimes in those moments when she saw a man in a suit raising his hand toward a camera. When she learned her daughter was dating a man named Ted who worked for the city, she felt uneasy, but still hoped it was only a coincidence. Until he walked into her house, the same face, only now with a few extra years of weariness in his eyes, and she understood that fate was playing a cruel joke. For Shanice, her mother's story felt like a slap that sent time backward. She had never known such detail about that trial, only vaguely remembered her mother coming home with swollen eyes and a silence that lasted 4 days. In a child's mind, everything had been simpler. Her father had died, people said it was an accident, and her mother became busier than ever trying to keep life together for the two of them. She had not been old enough to understand the full injustice, and when she grew up, she poured herself into studying, into the dream of becoming someone who saved other people's lives. As a way to fight back against that old helplessness, she met Ted when she was already a grown woman, a professional devoted to her patients, someone who had learned to gather her pain into one corner and keep moving. What made her love Ted was not his reputation or his position, but the times he patiently sat and listened while she talked about severe cases. The times he saw her after a night shift and offered to drive her home, without pushing, without asking for anything except making sure she got home safely. She loved seeing a man who looked hard and unshakable in the media yet knew how to lower his head and apologize when he was late. Loved the quiet in a hotel room when they sat eating takeout and silently watching a game. Loved even the crease between his brows when she told him about a sick child. So when her mother told her that this man had once stood on the other side, had used his intelligence to make her father's death seem weightless in the eyes of the law, one part of Shanice's heart wanted to resist, wanted to believe that past could not possibly belong to the same man she loved now. But another part felt the ground being pulled away beneath her, realizing that all this time she had loved without knowing she was standing on top of a pit, and once the secret's lid came off, everything could collapse. For Ted, the moment he heard Shanice's mother bring up that old case felt like someone opening a door in his memory that had long been carefully locked. He remembered, but he had chosen not to think about it. In his career, Ted had handled many cases. There were decisions he was proud of, and there were cases he considered moral stains but justified by telling himself he had been young then. Still full of the illusion that law was only a game of arguments. The case involving Shanice's family belonged to the second group. He remembered the woman standing at the witness stand that year, remembered the way she trembled but still tried to answer every question. Remembered the furious yet hopeless look in her eyes when her lawyer faltered under each sharp argument Ted presented. He had convinced the jury that the city was not liable, that the accident happened in a building long after the family had failed to properly report repeated issues with the weak stairs. That Shanice's father rushing downstairs in panic had also contributed to the tragedy. He knew all those arguments, even if technically valid in legal terms, were knives cutting deep into a family's pain, but at the time winning and losing were everything, and he had won. After that, he tucked the case away in the drawer of professional achievements, allowing his conscience to bite only occasionally before burying it again. When he met Shanice years later, he did not recognize the connection because they had never spoken deeply about her father's death, only shared emotional fragments. Mutual fears about how good people are rarely acknowledged. He loved her as a man loves a woman he believes he might still be good enough to deserve, not realizing he himself was part of the deepest tragedy in her life. Now, with the secret dragged into the light by Shanice's mother, every excuse he had used to forgive himself felt hollow. He saw himself as an intruder, stepping into the life of the daughter of the woman he had once pushed into despair, then hoping to be forgiven as if present-day love were enough to erase the marks of the past. After the confrontation, Ted became distant, but not in the cold way Leslie used to describe him. Rather in the way of a man trapped between the instinct to fight for love and the feeling that he no longer had the right to do so. He began texting less. Calls were postponed because of endless meetings whose content he could barely remember. And evenings once spent having dinner with Shanice turned into hours sitting alone in his hotel room, flipping through old files from that case, rereading every line of Shanice's mother's testimony. Every argument he had used to diminish her voice. He did not know what to say if he saw Shanice, because any explanation would sound like an excuse for the version of Ted he had tried to bury. To him, his silence was a clumsy attempt not to hurt Shanice further, the way he thought he was protecting her from details too painful to revisit, details he knew better than anyone. But to Shanice, that silence became the first crack. She was not angry because her mother had told the truth. She was angry because Ted disappeared at the exact moment she needed him most, if only to admit that the past was real. She felt as if the man who always promised not to leave her alone during her hardest hospital shifts had turned his back at the very moment her private life became a psychological emergency. As the distance between them grew, Leslie smelled blood in the water. The woman who had already done everything she could to sabotage this relationship, from malicious whispers to the underwear stunt at the hotel, now discovered there was a secret big enough to push both of them off a cliff without her needing to invent anything else. Somehow, Leslie heard the story through gossip at the club or from Shanice's mother's own burst of rage, and in her mind a new plan took shape immediately. This time, instead of attacking with cheap, dirty tricks, she chose to attack with the truth, because nothing destroys a person faster than a past they want to deny. Leslie wanted to see Shanice break. Wanted Ted exposed as a hypocrite in the eyes of the Fairmont Crest community. Wanted the humiliation she felt after Donnie and Shanice publicly embarrassed her on Valentine's Day repaid many times over. Every move Leslie calculated was driven by her feeling of exclusion, by the belief that everyone inside this gated world had always seen her as an outsider. And the way they welcomed Shanice into that world only fed her hatred. She did not see the fragility of Ted and Shanice's relationship as a chance for them to face each other honestly, only as a crack where she could drive the knife deeper. And yet this was exactly where things began moving in a direction Leslie did not expect. Once the secret spread beyond the family, Shanice was forced to face the question she had tried to delay. Could she love a man who had once embodied the worst injustice of her life? The day she decided to go see Ted, she no longer carried the urgency of a woman running toward comfort, but the heavy steps of someone about to choose between her heart and her memory. She realized that all of Leslie's schemes and interference before, from disgusting tricks to sly insinuations, had never truly shaken her feelings for Ted. On the contrary, every time they dealt with Leslie, they had felt like a team, standing side by side, facing the same direction, fighting chaos from outside their door. That was what made their relationship seem stable and promising, because they had overcome tests that came from outside. But this time, the enemy was not outside. It was inside Ted's own history. This was no longer a question of trusting or mistrusting fidelity, but of whether Shanice could believe the man she loved had changed enough not to be the same person who once stood by while her family collapsed. Ted had to ask himself the same question. Should he walk away from Shanice to protect her from the truth, spare her from being dragged back every time she looked at his face to that courtroom, that collapsed staircase, her father's coffin? Or should he stay and let them both stand together in front of that wound, accepting it as an unerasable part of their shared story? He understood that either choice would leave scars. If he left, Shanice might heal faster, build a life no longer shadowed by the man who had once made her mother cry in court. But she might also live with a hole inside her, forever wondering whether she had pushed away a chance at redemption. An opportunity to turn a mistake from the past into a reason to live better in the present. If he stayed, they would have to survive long days under the judgmental eyes of the community. The whispers that Shanice had betrayed her father's memory by loving the man who once fought against her family, and he would have to learn not to react. not to run. Not to use arguments to defend himself as he had in court, but simply stand there and take responsibility for who he had been. The silence that had stretched across the past few days was no longer a protective shield. It had become a weapon turned back against him, making Shanice feel abandoned when she needed one honest acknowledgement more than anything. In the end, when the real confrontation between them finally came, it did not explode the way Leslie imagined, with noise loud enough for the whole apartment to hear. Instead, it unfolded in a heavy stillness, where two people who had once found peace in each other now had to face the darkest part of the shared history they had stumbled into. Shanice was no longer the confident woman at Ted's side at uptown parties, but a woman standing before a man who was both her present and her past. She had to dig into her own motives, asking herself whether she was clinging to Ted as a way to escape old pain, whether forgiving him would mean betraying her father, or whether it would be a way to transform a tragic chapter into a foundation for a new one with greater meaning. Ted understood that anything he said at this point could sound like self-defense, so he chose to let actions speak. He handed Shanice the entire case file from that year, unhidden, unedited, forcing himself to face every line he had written or signed. It was the only way he could think of to prove he was no longer the man he had been, not by denying what happened, but by accepting that he had done it and was now willing to face whatever judgment she gave him. In that moment, the question of whether their love was strong enough to survive this secret threatening to destroy everything still had no answer. But one thing was clear: all of Leslie's schemes, all the poisonous interference from outside, were only surface lines compared to this underground storm. Those things could not split them because they attacked outward trust, reputation, ego, while the secret Shanice's mother exposed struck at the soul of the relationship, forcing both of them to decide whether they were brave enough to make it a foundation or let it bring everything down. Why Shanice's mother had reacted so fiercely was no longer a mystery. She had simply done the only thing a mother could do when she saw her daughter place her heart in the hands of the man she had once believed crushed their family in front of the whole city. Her anger was not only hatred, but fear that history would repeat itself, that blind trust would once again turn Shanice into a victim. And Shanice, standing between her mother and the man she loved, between her father's death and an unwritten future, had to understand that sometimes love is not tested by betrayals in the present, but by decisions made in the past that neither person can go back and change. What she will choose, only time can answer. But one thing is certain: from the moment the secret was exposed, their relationship was no longer a quiet love story built from whispered conversations, but a real struggle between memory and hope, justice and compassion, between protecting an old wound and allowing it to heal in a new way.